Hello, and welcome to Global Women's History. I'm so glad you can be with us. In this brief PowerPoint, I want to give you an introduction to the class and give you a sense of the materials that we're looking at this week. First, let me talk a little bit about how the course is set up. Every week, you'll have readings. The first few weeks, the readings are on D2L because I'm not sure everyone will have bought the textbook yet. And then for the remainder of the course, you'll be reading things from your main textbook, Women in World History. Let me know if you're having a problem getting the textbook. Each week, you need to complete several assignments. There are vocabulary terms, more information about that under the Content tab. This week's vocabulary terms are lineage, compulsory heterosexuality, and hunter-gatherers. These are things you'll find in the reading, and you're going to want to write a several-sentence definition of each and turn them in following the information in the file. Every week there's also a discussion. You have the option most weeks, including this week, to join a live discussion. This week it'll be Thursday at 7, and there's a link provided, and if you go there, you can hear me and see me. You can speak or you can type chat. It's a great way to connect with class members and discuss the material. But there's also always the option to engage in written discussion, so you can do it on your own time if the time I pick for live discussion isn't good. Both of those options are found under the Communication tab. And finally, the exams in this class are written cumulatively. That is, every week you can answer one of the exam questions so they don't all have to wait to the end. In this week's question, I'm asking you to compare and contrast the family structures of the societies in Chapter 1 of Envisioning Women in World History. You're reading for this week. In that chapter, you look at a society in Mesoamerica, one in Europe, and Ming China. And what I'm asking you to think about is which of these societies seemed most favorable for girls, which were least favorable, and why. There's lots of issues to be considered. To give you a little background of what we're doing in class in general, I've also assigned an introductory textbook chapter. And in that chapter, you'll notice that the author discusses questions about gender, sex, and marriage that we're going to want to think about throughout the class. In a way, this is a class where we want to think about women's opportunities as compared to those of their brothers, wives of their husbands, mothers and fathers, things like that. This is a way of considering the rights and responsibilities, the opportunities, and the restrictions that were gender-based in world cultures. We'll look at issues like access to education. Who had access to education, and how did that shape women's lives? Inheritance laws and the ideas of lineage. Who passes down family money to whom, and how does one inherit, and how does that shape ideas about children and marriage? We'll look at livelihoods. What kinds of occupations could women engage in, and how did that shape their lives? In this class, we have a very central focus on marriage, decisions about how marriages are arranged or decided on. Do people marry for love, or do their parents set up their marriages? Do they marry one person? Is this a monogamous marriage, or will it be a polygamous marriage? And what about divorce? Are there ways of ending marriages in this society, and what are the implications of those? We'll also look at things like freedom of movement. Can women go anywhere in society? Are there female and male spaces in society? How is that reflected in dress and in other forms of movement? And finally, we'll look at issues of sexuality and whether women are considered to be sexual or non-sexual, who has sexual access, all kinds of things like that. As we go through the weeks, you'll gather more and more information, so you'll begin to see comparisons. Discussion is another place in which we'll try to make those comparisons by looking at multiple societies at one time. Finally, this week, in the chapter that you're reading on prehistory to 1500, you're going to see some information about doing women's history. One of the things that you're going to read about is the fact that it's difficult to know a lot of things about women's history in certain societies and from certain time periods. We simply lack the sources. Questions we might have about feelings or sexuality often aren't recorded, and therefore, the chapters you read are sketching together as best we can stories about women's lives. In this particular chapter, you'll also be reading about the earliest societies, particularly hunters and gatherers, and the roles that men and women played in those societies. I'll be asking you to consider the question, does biology dictate which tasks are taken by men and by women? There's also a section on the agricultural society, and we'll see some changes in gender role as civilizations become sedentary and adopt agriculture. And finally, we'll consider the impact of the growth of the state. That is, as you get governments and more settled leadership, how does that impact the experiences of women? Does an increasing power of the state, in fact, decrease the opportunities available to women? And do we see this over multiple societies? In your exam question this week, you'll have a chance to look at that as well. If you have any questions or concerns about the class, please reach out to me. Once you've finished a week, hopefully we'll all have a hang of it and it will make a great deal more sense. The three societies that you're going to look at the end of the chapter, as I've mentioned, are Ming China, Europe during the High Renaissance, and Mesoamerica. And I want you to keep in mind some questions like, who are powerful women in these societies? Are they identified by age or by class? Does a shortage of women improve the position of women? Does poverty offer some women freedom that wealth does not? We want to think about those questions from the beginning of this PowerPoint. Do women have access to education? What's the deal with widows and marrying again? Who inherits money? And in societies where there are slavery or human sacrifice, what role does that play in women's experiences? In the end, the chapter summarizes by suggesting that all the societies we're going to look at will have some kind of gender role. That is, each society has an idea about what is male and what is female, and perhaps in some cases, what are alternative genders as well. And in every case, we're going to see examples of roles that are mutually complementary and often indispensable. That is, most societies want there to be multiple kinds of roles that work together to make a family as well as a society exist. And so in a most primary way, we're going to be looking at the construction of those gender roles and considering who decides what is feminine or masculine, who benefits from those roles, how do they shape the contours of society, and how are they changed over time. Lots of big questions, lots of things to think about. I hope you enjoy this week.